there was some rhetorical exchanges. There were some superficial signs of goodwill. It was a different atmosphere than Bush, and the Latin Americans were happy that they weren't insulted and kicked in the face and so on, and that Obama seemed friendly. So there's a difference in style and a difference in rhetoric. But as Obama himself said at the summit, what matters is not words, but deeds. And there were no deeds to speak of. You don't really expect that at a summit, so in a way it's not disappointing. But the main issue that kind of overshadowed the summit was Cuba. The Latin Americans are adamant that Cuba should be restored to the Western Hemisphere system. And Bush and Obama continued Bush's policy of saying, we won't allow that. I mean, he was highly praised, Obama, for rescinding some of the more extreme Bush restrictions on travel and funding. These are just Bush directives. Hasn't been policy before then. And he rescinded them. In fact, these were so extreme that even the Cuban American community was strongly opposed to them, so they welcomed the rescinding of these agreements. But the opinion of the American people is just disregarded. And it's kind of an interesting case. I mean, there was just another poll, I think maybe 70% or something of the population wants to establish normal relations. But that's been going on for decades, ever since polls started to be taken, and I think it was the 1970s. Approximately 2/3 of the population were in favor of normalizing relations with Cuba, or at least strong steps towards that. And the government has totally disregarded them. And Obama continues. He says the embargo will continue. That's the crucial part. One thing has changed in recent years, but it's not Obama, and that is the direct support for terrorist acts against Cuba. That leveled off by the 80s, probably. They still go on, but not with direct U.S. support. That was very serious terrorism under the, especially Kennedy and later Johnson and Nixon administrations. But that has declined, maybe ended. We don't know of any direct attacks for several years. But the embargo, which is an effort to strangle the economy, that continues. Now, there is debate about it here. The U.S. is alone in this. I mean, the whole world is opposed. You can see it at the regular UN General Assembly meetings. Of course, Latin America is totally opposed. But the last vote at the UN, I think, was something like 180 to 4 or something like that. It was the United States, Israel, which votes reflexively with the United States but disregards the embargo, and a couple of Pacific islands, so essentially alone. And that remains in force. It has its critics. So, for example, the Boston Globe, kind of on the liberal side, it's had an editorial right at the time of the summit saying that we should rethink the embargo. It's not achieving its goal of bringing democracy to Cuba. How do the editors know that that's the goal? Well, there's some evidence, namely that's what our leaders say. But by that argument, Stalin's goal was to bring democracy to the world, because that's what he said, after all. And if you're serious, you don't pay any attention to what leaders say. That's standard boilerplate. And what you do is look at the record. And there's a very free country. We have a voluminous internal record, which explains why the embargo was established and why it's sustained. And it was very explicitly to punish the Cuban people. Punish the Cuban people so they'll overthrow the government. And that's stated very explicitly back to 1960, picked up in the Kennedy years, which was the most savage years, to punish the Cuban people, make them suffer, so they'll realize that the only way they can get out is to overthrow Castro. And and we have to overthrow Castro because of his successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to 1820s, namely the Monroe Doctrine, which declared the right of the United States to essentially dominate the hemisphere. It was a right that couldn't be implemented at the time. There was a deterrent, namely Britain, just too powerful. So the British fleet prevented us from incorporating Cuba into the expanding empire that the U.S. was founded as an empire. That's maybe the only country in the world, an infant empire, as George Washington called it. It was supposed to keep expanding. And Cuba was a major prize. In fact, by the 1820s, Cuba was considered the most important prize that the U.S. had to take in order to continue its expansion. It was realized at the time that they couldn't do it because the British were too strong, but John Quincy Adams, who was the great grand strategist of the period, highly honored for that today, his sensible proposal was that we should just wait. He said, by the laws of political gravitation, Cuba will fall into our hands the way an apple falls from the tree. What he meant was, we're going to get stronger, British are going to get weaker, and sooner or later we'll overcome the deterrent, we'll just grab the apple, which indeed happened. In 1898, the Cubans had effectively liberated themselves from Spain, and the U.S. intervened in what's called here the liberation of Cuba, but in fact was the prevention of Cuban liberation from Spain. The Cuban forces assisted the American invasion. They took the words, they listened to the words instead of paying attention to the deeds. It's a common mistake. So they helped the American troops land. They cleared the area. They could land without being killed and so on, but then they were dismissed. They weren't even allowed to attend the ceremony of Spanish surrender. And the U.S. then imposed regulations, including keeping Guantanamo, and an amendment, Platt Amendment, which said, well, we can intervene anytime we feel like it. And from then till 1959, Cuba was effectively a colony. In fact, mainstream American historians like Ernest May and Philip Zelikow just say it was a virtual colony until 1959, which is correct. As soon as Castro took over, a few months before definite decisions were made, but by late 1959, internal decisions were made to overthrow the government because of its successful defiance of U.S. policies and for other reasons, very familiar reasons. President Kennedy, as he was coming in, he intended to turn toward Latin America. It's a little bit like now. He said, well, we've been neglecting Latin America, like Bush was neglecting Latin America. Incidentally, the best thing that ever happened to them. It's during this period of neglect that Latin America was able to take some steps towards independence and dealing with internal problems and diversifying its external relations and so on. But now Obama's line, very much like Kennedy's, he likes to compare himself to Kennedy, was, okay, now we're going to pay attention to Latin America, so they better take that as a warning. I don't think he'll do it because they don't have the resources at the moment, but as Kennedy did, of course. But Kennedy had a Latin American mission that was supposed to review the situation in Latin America, give him advice as to what to do. It was headed by Arthur Schlesinger, the very renowned liberal historian, who was his Latin American advisor, close to Kennedy, and wrote the description of the first 1,000 days, and biography of Robert Kennedy, and so on. And Kennedy, the mission reported by Schlesinger said that there's a special problem with Cuba, and that is what he called the danger of the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, which he said would have considerable appeal to others in the hemisphere who are suffering from the same kind of repression, poverty, and so on that you found in Cuba. And that's really dangerous. And that's a very familiar theme. In fact, that's the basic principle of the post-Cold War period, you might say. There's a version of it called the domino theory. That's what's presented to the public. You know, the domino theory is, say, when Ronald Reagan declares a national emergency because the government of Nicaragua is only, its army is 2 days away from Texas, so we have to tremble, you know. But, or maybe if, you know, Grenada has a fishing cooperative, so maybe the Russians will land there and bomb us or something like that. Or, you know, Ho Chi Minh will conquer Indonesia, or whatever it may be. That's the public version of the domino theory, which is, it's constantly ridiculed.